Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we step into a grey American morning sometime in the 1890s where the air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp brick, and the sky has not quite decided whether it is night or day. You are already awake. In fact, you have been awake for a while because factory work has a funny way of rearranging your relationship with sleep. The whistle that rules the town does not care if you were comfortable in your bed. It only cares that you arrive on time. And just to give you a friendly heads up right away, you probably would not survive this job very long without aching feet, ringing ears, and a permanent relationship with exhaustion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know where you are listening from and what your local time is right now. I always love seeing how far these quiet little history journeys travel across the world. Now dim the lights, you step outside into the narrow street of your mill town, pulling your coat a little tighter against the chill. Dawn is still hesitating somewhere beyond the rooftops, and the world feels half asleep. Yet the street is already alive with footsteps. Other workers move in the same direction you are heading. Some carry small lunch pails. Others clutch pieces of bread wrapped in cloth. A few walk silently with hands in pockets, their faces still fogged with sleep. You fall into the quiet current of people drifting toward the same destination. The factory, even from several blocks away, you can see it rising above the town. The building is enormous. Long rows of windows stretch across its brick walls like unblinking eyes. A tall smokestack lifts into the dim sky, releasing a slow ribbon of grey smoke that spreads across the morning air. One well-established historical reality is that by the 1890s, factories had become the beating heart of American industrial cities. Steel mills, textile plants, shoe factories, meat-packing houses. They drew thousands of workers from farms, villages, and foreign countries into these growing towns. Standing here, you can feel why. The building is not simply a workplace. It is the centre of gravity for everything around it. Boarding houses, shops, bakeries, saloons, churches. The entire town orbits the rhythm of that factory whistle. You continue walking with the crowd boots scraping lightly across the dirt road. Someone ahead of you coughs into their sleeve. A horse wagon rattles past carrying barrels toward the loading dock. No one is speaking much. Morning conversation is a luxury that usually arrives later in the day. A faint glow begins to spread along the horizon, revealing more of the town around you. Rows of identical worker houses line the street. Laundry lines hang motionless in the cool air. A dog barks once and then decides the effort is not worth repeating. The closer you move toward the factory gates, the thicker the crowd becomes. Men in worn coats, women in shawls, teenagers who still look half like children. Entire families sometimes walk together until the moment they split toward different doors of the same building. A widely accepted historical detail is that industrial workers in the 1890s often began their shifts around 6 in the morning. That means waking well before sunrise, especially during winter months, when daylight arrives slowly. Your body may still be trying to negotiate with sleep, but the schedule leaves no room for negotiation. You approach the wide entrance yard in front of the factory. Already dozens of people are gathering there, forming loose lines near the gate. The ground beneath your feet is packed dirt mixed with coal dust. When you breathe in, you notice the faint metallic smell of machinery and smoke drifting from the building. It is not unpleasant exactly, but it is heavy. A strange little curiosity from this era is that many workers would eventually say they could recognize their factory simply by smell. Textile mills carried the scent of oil and cotton fibers. Steel plants smelled of hot metal and coal. Tanning factories had an odour strong enough to travel across entire neighbourhoods. Your nose, whether it likes it or not, will learn quickly. You reach the gate and slow your steps. A guard stands nearby with a small notebook, watching the growing crowd. The doors have not opened yet, but they will soon. People shift their weight from foot to foot. A man beside you yawns widely, then covers his mouth in embarrassment. Another worker pulls out a pocket watch and studies it as if the seconds might behave differently under close supervision. You notice how many faces around you look tired. Not dramatically tired, just the quiet, ordinary fatigue that comes from repeating the same early morning routine every day. Historians still argue whether industrial workers in the late 19th century actually felt more exhausted than earlier generations of farmers and craftsmen, or whether the difference was simply the rigid schedule imposed by factory bells. On farms, work followed daylight and seasons. In factories, time belonged to the clock, and clocks are much less forgiving. You glance up at the tall smokestack again. The smoke has thickened slightly now that the boilers inside the factory are waking up. Somewhere deep within the building, engineers are already tending the great steam engines that power the machinery. Those engines will soon begin turning belts and shafts that snake across the ceilings of the workrooms. You cannot hear them yet, but soon you will. A small boy squeezes through the crowd, carrying a basket of warm rolls. He calls out softly, offering breakfast to workers who left home too quickly to eat. A few coins exchange hands. Steam rises gently from the bread. Small businesses like this often grew around factory entrances, feeding hungry workers who had neither time nor kitchens large enough to prepare elaborate meals. You consider buying one, but you decide to save your coins. Payday is still several days away. The sky is now turning pale blue above the rooftops. Light creeps across the factory walls, illuminating the long windows and iron doors. And then it happens. The whistle. It erupts suddenly from the top of the building, a long metallic scream that tears through the quiet morning air. The sound is so loud that you feel it vibrate in your chest. Conversations stop instantly. Even the horses pulling wagons seem to flinch. The whistle is not just a signal, it is the town's heartbeat. Once it sounds, everything moves faster. Workers step forward in a thick wave toward the gate. Boots crunch against gravel. The guard begins allowing people inside. You move with the crowd, past the gate, across the yard, closer to the enormous doors where the real day will begin. And as you approach their entrance, you realise something quietly unsettling. This building is about to swallow hundreds of people at once, and it will not release them again until evening. The crowd presses forward at the moment the gate opens, and suddenly the quiet shuffling outside turns into a determined flow of boots and shoulders. You move with them across the factory yard, trying not to lose your place in the line. The ground here is rough and dark with coal dust, and the smell of hot metal and oil grows stronger with every step. Ahead of you stands the main entrance, a wide wooden door, already swinging open and shut as workers file through. Inside, a narrow corridor leads toward different workrooms, but before you reach any of that, there is one important stop. The hiring line. You slow slightly as the crowd divides into smaller groups. Some workers head directly toward their departments, people who already have steady positions inside. Others, like you today, drift toward a side area where a foreman stands beside a small desk. He looks like a man who has been awake even longer than you have. His coat is neat, his hair carefully combed, and in his hand he holds a clipboard with a list of names. A few men already stand in front of him, waiting with quiet patience that is not quite calm. This is the daily ritual of factory employment in many American cities during the 1890s. A commonly accepted historical detail is that not every worker had guaranteed hours. Some industries hired people day by day or week by week, depending on orders and production needs, which means every morning can feel a little like a test. You join the line and wait. Behind you, someone clears their throat. Ahead of you, a man shifts his weight nervously from one boot to the other. Nobody wants to speak too loudly. The foreman is listening. When the first worker steps forward, the foreman glances at him quickly. Worked here before, he asks. The man nods. Name. The foreman checks his list, scratches something with a pencil, and waves him through the door with a brief flick of the hand. The whole exchange takes less than 10 seconds. Efficiency is the language of factories. Your turn arrives faster than expected. You step forward, trying to look capable, alert, and above all, useful. The foreman studies you with the quick, calculating gaze of someone who has done this hundreds of times. Experience, he asks. You mentioned the small workshop where you worked previously. Not quite a factory, but close enough that the machines will not be entirely foreign. He nods once. A widely documented fact from the industrial era is that foremen often relied on quick judgment rather than formal interviews. If you looked strong enough, sober enough, and willing enough to work, that could be enough. He writes your name. Report to the spinning room, he says, pointing down the corridor. And just like that, you are hired. It feels surprisingly anticlimactic. No contract, no handshake, just a pencil mark on a sheet of paper and a gesture toward the machines that will soon define your day. You walk down the corridor with several other newly accepted workers. The hallway walls are brick darkened by years of soot and oil. Small windows high above let in thin strips of pale morning light. You can hear something now, a distant rumble. At first, it sounds like thunder somewhere far away. Then it grows clearer, the steady turning of machinery waking up across the building. Before you reach the workroom, another worker leans toward you. First week, he asks quietly. You nod. He chuckles softly. Just keep your hands quick and your eyes open. That, it seems, is the entire training program. Another well-known reality of early industrial labour is that formal instruction was minimal. Many workers learned by watching others and imitating what they saw. Factories valued speed more than careful teaching. Mistakes, unfortunately, were part of the process. You pass a small window in the corridor where a clerk sits behind a desk, counting coins into small envelopes. Even from a distance, you recognise what that must be. Pay. Not today, of course, but eventually. The thought makes you curious. So you ask the worker beside you how much the job pays. He shrugs. Depends on the week. Maybe $9 if the hours are full. $9. It sounds decent at first, until you begin mentally subtracting rent, food, coal for heating and the occasional pair of boots when the old ones finally surrender. A curious little detail from the time is that many factories paid wages in cash, sealed inside envelopes, usually distributed once a week or sometimes every 2 weeks. Workers would line up at the pay office on Saturday evening, hoping the amount inside would stretch far enough. The envelope itself carried a certain emotional weight, sometimes relief, sometimes disappointment, sometimes both at once. You reach the end of the corridor, where the door to the spinning room stands slightly open. Through the gap you can already see movement and hear the roar of machinery. But before stepping inside, the worker next to you adds something quietly. Watch your pay envelope, he says. Fines come out quick. You look at him. Fines. He nods. Late arrivals, broken threads, talking too much. They write it down. Factory discipline in the 1890s often included systems of small penalties that employers claimed encouraged efficiency. Docked wages could accumulate over the week, trimming precious coins from a worker's pay. Historians still debate whether these fines truly improved productivity or simply gave management another method of control. Either way, you suspect you will soon learn firsthand. The door to the spinning room opens wider as another group enters ahead of you, and suddenly the sound becomes overwhelming. The machines inside are enormous long rows of spinning frames stretching across the room like metal rivers. Belts whip overhead, turning shafts that power hundreds of moving parts. The noise fills every corner of the space. Talking here will require raised voices. Thinking might require practice. You hesitate for a brief second on the threshold. Behind you, the corridor continues feeding more workers into the room like a steady current. There is no real pause in the flow. You take a breath, step inside, and somewhere in the building, the great steam engine deep in the boiler room turns another massive wheel, sending power through belts and shafts that hum across the ceiling. The workday has begun. Your first pay envelope is still days away, but already you understand something important. Earning it will not be easy. The moment you step fully into the spinning room, the world changes. Sound becomes the first thing you notice. It is not simply loud, it is constant. Hundreds of machines clatter and hum at the same time, each producing its own rhythm that blends into a single roaring atmosphere. The belts above your head whip across metal wheels. Spindles spin so quickly they appear almost blurred. You instinctively look around for a quiet corner. There is none. Your ears struggle to sort the noise into recognizable pieces. At first it feels chaotic, then slowly you begin to detect patterns. The repeating click of threads catching on hooks, the soft whir of rotating rollers, the heavy thump of large drive shafts turning overhead. Many factory workers eventually describe this experience in the same way. After a few weeks, the noise fades into the background of your mind. At the beginning, however, it feels like standing inside a thunderstorm that never moves away. You take a few careful steps forward, watching how the other workers move around the machines. Each person tends a section of spinning frames that stretch along the room in long parallel rows. The air is warm, not pleasantly warm. The kind of warmth that builds slowly from steam pipes, moving machinery, and hundreds of bodies working in the same enclosed space. A faint haze floats in the air, made from tiny cotton fibres that drift down from the spinning threads. When you breathe in, you taste dust. A widely documented fact from textile mills of the late 19th century is that airborne fibres were everywhere inside these buildings. Workers inhaled them all day without masks or ventilation systems. The long-term effects were something people would only begin fully understanding many years later. For now, you simply cough once and wipe your nose. The worker who spoke to you in the corridor gestures toward an empty spot along a machine. This one he says loudly. You nod and step beside him. Up close, the machine is even more complicated than it appeared from the doorway. Dozens of spindles rotate along a metal rail, each twisting thin cotton strands into stronger thread. The movement is fast and precise. Every part seems to depend on another part. Your companion reaches forward and demonstrates. Thread breaks, he says, pointing to one spindle. You tie it quick. He shows how to pinch two loose strands together and twist them with practiced fingers. The motion takes him less than 3 seconds. Then he points to another area. Too much slack, it tangles. Watch that. You nod again. There will be no lecture, no instruction manual. Learning happens through observation and repetition. This kind of informal training was extremely common in factories across the United States during the industrial boom. New workers were expected to absorb techniques simply by standing beside experienced ones. Mistakes were expected, but not particularly welcomed. You study the machine carefully. Each spindle holds a narrow cone where thread gradually collects. When one feels it must be replaced quickly, so the machine does not stop. Every few minutes, you see workers walking past, carrying trays of fresh cones. The pace of motion around the room never truly slows. Another curious little detail from industrial textile work is that many mills deliberately kept the air slightly humid. Moist air helped prevent cotton threads from snapping too easily during spinning. Unfortunately, that same humidity also made the rooms feel heavier and harder to breathe in. You can already feel a thin layer of moisture forming on your skin. The worker beside you suddenly taps your arm and points. A thread has snapped. You react half a second too late, fumbling slightly before tying the ends together. The machine jerks once as the tension returns. Your neighbour laughs softly. "Better quick next time." His tone is not unkind. Around you, other workers move with astonishing speed. Fingers dart in and out of the machinery with the confidence of long practice. Some barely glance at the threads they repair. It begins to dawn on you that the machines are not just tools, they are rhythms. And the workers who survive here learn to match that rhythm perfectly. You glance toward the far end of the room, where a tall man walks slowly between the rows. He carries a small notebook and watches the workers carefully. The foreman, his presence changes the atmosphere slightly. Conversations fade. Movements become a little sharper. Factory supervision in the 1890s relied heavily on foremen who monitored output and discipline. They tracked which machines stopped too often and which workers seemed too slow. Historians continue to debate how much freedom these foremen truly had. Some scholars believe they exercised enormous authority inside the factory, while others argue their power was limited by the expectations of higher management. From where you stand, however, he looks powerful enough. The foreman pauses beside a worker a few rows away. He points at something on the machine, says a few sharp words, then scribbles in his notebook before walking on. The worker nods silently and speeds up his movements. You begin to understand what your neighbour meant about fines. Time passes strangely inside the spinning room. Without windows closer by, you cannot easily track the movement of the sun. The only reliable marker of time is the steady turning of machines and the occasional shout from supervisors. You focus on the small section of spindles assigned to you. Tie broken threads. Replace full cones. Watch for tangles. Repeat. At first, every task requires concentration. Your fingers feel clumsy compared to the smooth motions of the workers around you. But gradually the movements start to become more natural. A few minutes later, another thread snaps. This time you catch it quickly. Your neighbour nods in approval. That is better. You glance up again at the endless rows of machinery stretching across the room. The belts above continue their constant motion, delivering power from the great steam engine somewhere deep within the building. And you realise something quietly remarkable. Every shirt blanket and bolt of cloth that leaves this factory begins in rooms like this. Hundreds of spinning threads turning raw cotton into the fabric that fills shops across the country. That enormous transformation happens one spindle at a time, right here. And if the rhythm of the machines ever stops, the entire chain of production pauses with it, which means the work must continue. Hour after hour, thread after thread, machine after machine. The roaring room carries on around you steady and relentless, and your shift has only just begun. You begin to notice something curious about the machines after a while. They have personalities, not in the friendly sense, of course, more like temperaments. Some run smoothly with a steady hum that almost feels predictable. Others rattle, slightly shiver at certain speeds, or throw threads loose at the worst possible moment. The worker beside you seems to recognise this immediately. He leans toward one of the frames and taps the metal casing lightly. "This one's moody," he shouts over the noise. You are not entirely sure whether he is joking, but after a few minutes, you begin to understand what he means. One spindle snaps its thread twice in quick succession. Another keeps producing loose coils that need constant adjustment. A third runs perfectly for nearly 10 minutes without needing a single touch. You start to realise that learning factory work is not just about memorising steps. It is about reading the behaviour of the machine itself. The man next to you moves down the row, watching carefully. "See the vibration," he says, pointing to a slight tremor in one spinning frame. You squint at the metal rail and finally notice the faint shaking. If that gets worse, he continues, threads will start flying. You nod, storing the observation away like a survival tip. Accounts from the late 19th century often describe how factory workers developed an almost instinctive awareness of their machines. After enough hours on the floor, many could hear subtle changes in sound or rhythm long before an actual breakdown occurred. It is a skill learned slowly, and usually the hard way. You move along your section, checking each spindle again. The thread cones are filling gradually thin strands, wrapping themselves into neat white shapes. The speed of the motion still surprises you. The cotton fibres spin so quickly that they look almost like a faint blur of pale smoke. You reach forward to tie another broken thread. Your fingers are slightly more confident now, still clumsy compared to the veterans around you, but improving. As you work, you notice something else about the room. The workers rarely stand still. Everyone is in motion. Some walk briskly along the rows, replacing cones. Others dart forward to catch snapped threads before they tangle. A few carry trays stacked with fresh bobbins that will soon feed the next cycle of spinning. The room is alive with small constant adjustments. Observers writing about American textile mills in the 1890s frequently remarked on this steady choreography of labour. Dozens or sometimes hundreds of people moved through the same space, each performing small tasks that kept the larger machinery running smoothly. It is not chaotic exactly, but it is relentless. A bell somewhere in the distance rings once. You glance up, instinctively wondering if that means a break. It does not. Your neighbour laughs when he sees your hopeful expression. Just the hour mark, he says. The bell, it seems, is simply keeping time. You glance toward the far wall, where a tall clock hangs above the doorway. Its hands creep forward slowly, though somehow the seconds feel longer inside this room. You return your attention to the machine. Another thread breaks. You fix it. A tray of full cones appears beside you, carried by a young girl who looks no older than 15. She moves quickly down the row, collecting finished spools and replacing them with empty ones. Many factories during this period relied on teenagers for these lighter but fast-paced tasks. Smaller hands could move quickly between the spinning frames, and the wages for young workers were lower. She finishes her row and disappears into another aisle. A small but memorable detail recorded in some factory reports is that experienced workers could sometimes tell when a new employee had joined the room simply by listening. The pattern of machine stoppages would change slightly as beginners struggled to keep up. You wonder if that is happening right now. If somewhere across the floor someone has noticed your learning curve. The thought makes you focus harder. You tie another thread, adjust another cone. The rhythm begins settling deeper into your muscles. At one point, you glance up and notice the foreman again moving between the rows. He pauses near a machine several aisles away, where two workers are leaning toward each other, talking. Even from a distance, you can see his expression tighten. He says something sharply. The workers immediately return to their tasks. Discipline inside factories could be surprisingly strict. Time lost to conversation or distraction was often treated as wasted productivity, and productivity was the entire reason this building existed. Still, not every moment on the factory floor is grim. At one point, your neighbour nudges you and points toward a man across the aisle who has tucked a small folded newspaper inside the machine frame. Every few minutes, the man sneaks a quick glance at the page while pretending to adjust his spindles. The headline seems to be about a baseball game. Your neighbour grins. Tom follows the scores all day. You cannot help smiling slightly. Even here, between spinning threads and roaring belts, people find ways to carry small pieces of the outside world with them. You return your attention to your machine just as another cone fills completely. This time you replace it smoothly without hesitation. The motion feels almost automatic now. Hands forward. Lift the full cone. Slide the empty one into place. Guide the thread. Done. For a brief moment, you feel something close to satisfaction. You have not mastered the machine yet, but you are beginning to understand it. And understanding in a place like this might be the difference between surviving the job and being swallowed by it. The spinning room continues its endless motion around you. The belts above whisper and snap as they transfer power through the building. Every worker follows the same unspoken rule. Keep the machines moving. Keep the threads alive. Keep the rhythm unbroken. Because once the machines begin to slow, the foreman will notice. And in a factory like this, the machine's temper is only half the problem. The longer you stand beside the spinning frames, the stranger time begins to feel. At first the minutes crawl past like stubborn mules. Every small movement requires attention. Every snapped thread demands immediate repair. Your mind keeps checking the tall clock on the wall, as if the hands might suddenly leap forward out of sympathy. They never do. Instead, the work continues at exactly the same pace. Tie the thread. Replace the cone. Watch the spindles. Walk 3 steps down the row. Start again. You begin to understand why experienced workers rarely look at the clock. Time inside the factory does not pass the way it does outside. It stretches. After what feels like a long while, the bell rings again somewhere deeper in the building. The sound is sharp but brief. Workers barely react. You glance toward your neighbour. "Break, you shout." He shakes his head. "Half hour yet." So the bell was simply marking another slice of the morning. Factories during the industrial boom were deeply obsessed with timekeeping. Production depended on thousands of small motions happening in predictable rhythm. To maintain that rhythm, bells, whistles and clocks divided the day into strict segments. Many workers who had grown up on farms found this new relationship with time surprisingly difficult. Agricultural work had always followed the sun and the seasons. In a factory, the clock ruled everything, even hunger. Your stomach reminds you of this fact with a soft complaint. You left home with only a small piece of bread earlier, and the smell of warm oil and cotton dust does very little to satisfy an empty stomach. Across the aisle, a man reaches into his coat pocket and quietly pulls out a small apple. He takes quick bites between adjustments of his machine. The motion is practiced. Eat when you can, work when you must. Records from the period frequently mention that workers developed these tiny strategies to survive long shifts. A quick sip from a hidden flask of water. A bite of bread taken while walking between machines. Small moments stolen without interrupting production. The room itself has grown warmer. Steam pipes run along the ceiling and walls keeping the air humid enough for the spinning threads. The result is a heavy warmth that slowly seeps into your clothes. Your shirt sticks slightly to your back. You wipe your forehead with the back of your hand and keep moving. At the far end of the room, a tray of bobbins tips slightly as a young worker hurries past. Several wooden spools clatter onto the floor and roll in different directions. The sound stands out sharply against the mechanical roar. For a second, several heads turn. The boy drops to his knees, gathering the bobbins as quickly as he can. His movements are frantic, but careful, as though every second matters. The foreman notices the commotion. He walks over slowly. You cannot hear what he says from this distance, but the boy nods repeatedly while scooping the last spools back into the tray. Within moments, the scene dissolves back into the normal rhythm of work. Little disruptions like that happen more often than you might expect. A belt slipping loose, a cone falling, a thread tangling badly enough to stop a section of the machine. Yet somehow the larger rhythm of the room absorbs these moments and continues. Another small curiosity from the industrial era is that workers often measured their day not by the clock, but by physical sensations. The ache in the lower back, the dryness in the throat, the dull buzzing in the ears from constant noise. These signals gradually replace the sun as the markers of passing hours. You feel the first hints of that now. Your feet begin to protest from standing in the same narrow space. The muscles in your shoulders tighten each time you lean forward to tie another thread. You stretch briefly while walking to the next spindle. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper glances quickly at his hidden sports page again, before tucking it back into the machine frame. Even in this relentless environment, human habits manage to survive. At last, after what feels like a small eternity, the bell rings in a longer, more deliberate tone. The reaction in the room is immediate. Workers step back from their machines almost in unison. That's the meal break, your neighbour says. You feel relief rush through you faster than expected. The machines do not stop entirely. Some sections continue running, while others slow slightly, depending on the department. But many workers step away toward the side of the room where benches line the walls. You follow them. Your legs feel strangely stiff as you walk. The benches are simple wooden planks attached to the wall. Workers sit shoulder to shoulder, opening small lunch pails or cloth bundles. Someone nearby unwraps a sandwich thick with onions, and the sharp smell cuts through the air. You sit down and pull out your modest piece of bread. Across from you, two workers begin discussing the local baseball team with quiet enthusiasm. Another group debates the weather forecast for the coming week. Even here, conversation stays brief. 30 minutes passes quickly. A detail frequently mentioned in reports about factory life is that meal breaks were short and strictly timed. In many places, a half hour was considered generous. You chew slowly, letting your legs rest. Around you, the spinning room looks almost peaceful for the first time since morning. Machines continue turning in some areas, but the absence of constant movement gives the space a strange calm. For a moment you imagine what the room might feel like at night when every machine finally stops. Then the bell rings again. Workers rise almost immediately. Lunch pails close. Cloth bundles fold. Conversations end mid-sentence. You stand up with the others brushing crumbs from your coat. The rhythm returns without hesitation. Back to the machines. Back to the spinning threads. Back to the long stretch of hours that still lie between you and the evening whistle. Your neighbour claps you lightly on the shoulder as you take your place beside the frame again. Half the day left, he says. The spindles spin faster as the machines reach full speed once more, and the factory, satisfied with its brief pause, resumes its endless motion. You return to your place beside the spinning frame, and the noise quickly swallows the quiet that the meal break briefly offered. The belts above begin whipping faster again as the machines reach their full speed. Within moments, the entire room sounds exactly as it did earlier in the morning. The pause already feels distant. Your hands resume their rhythm almost automatically. Check the threads, replace the cones, watch for loose fibres drifting toward the rollers. The motions are still new to you, but your body is beginning to recognize the pattern. Across the aisle, the young girl who carried the bobbin trays earlier returns with another stack balanced carefully against her hip. She moves quickly, but with confidence, weaving through the narrow paths between machines. You notice something now that you missed before. Several other children are working in the room as well. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, crouches near a machine base, sweeping cotton lint into a small metal pan. Another girl walks briskly down the row collecting full spools. The sight might surprise someone visiting from a later century, but in the 1890s it was not unusual. Employment records from textile mills across the United States show that thousands of children worked in factories during this period, often helping their families supplement household income. Some were only a little younger than the machines themselves. You watch the boy with the pan for a moment. His job requires him to move quickly between the spinning frames, clearing away the lint that gathers beneath the machines. The work keeps the floor safer and prevents loose fibres from tangling in the moving parts. He glances up briefly, meeting your eyes for a second before returning to his task. Your neighbour notices your expression. His mother works 2 rows down, he says. You look toward the direction he gestures and see a woman adjusting several threads at once with quick practice movements. She moves through her section with the same steady pace you have been trying to learn all morning. Family labour was common in many factory towns. When wages were low and rent was high, every working member of the household helped keep food on the table. The system was not always comfortable, but it was familiar. You return your attention to your machine just as 2 threads snap almost simultaneously. Your fingers move quickly to repair them. Tie, twist, release. This time the repair is smoother. A woman across the aisle notices and gives you a small approving nod before returning to her own machine. It feels like a quiet initiation. The spinning room is filled with workers of different ages and backgrounds. Some speak with accents that reveal recent arrival from distant countries. You hear fragments of Italian German and something that might be Polish drifting between the rows when the machines briefly slow. American factories in the late 19th century became gathering points for immigrants arriving from across Europe. Entire neighbourhoods grew around these workplaces, each street echoing with different languages and traditions. Inside the factory, however, communication often relied more on gestures than words. Point to the thread, tap the spindle, show the knot. The machine becomes the shared language. At one point you notice the foreman speaking quietly with a group of women near the far wall. He gestures toward one machine where the threads seem to be tangling repeatedly. One of the women nods and adjusts a small lever along the side of the frame. The tension changes slightly and the threads begin running more smoothly again. Even small mechanical adjustments can affect the entire line of production. The girl with the bobbin tray returns once more and pauses briefly near you. Full cones, she asks. You nod and hand her 3 spools. She places them in the tray with a quick practice motion before sliding 3 empty ones into your hands. Keep them tight, she says, already moving toward the next worker. The advice is simple but practical. Another curious observation recorded by some labour inspectors of the time is that children working in mills often became surprisingly skilled at their tasks. Because they began so young, many developed a deep familiarity with the machines long before adulthood. Of course, that skill came at the cost of long hours and early responsibility. You watch the boy sweeping lint again. His movements are careful near the turning belts, suggesting that he has already learned where danger lives inside the machine. Across the room, a sudden shout rises above the noise. For a moment, the machines continue spinning, but several workers turn their heads toward the sound. A thread bundle has tangled badly in one of the frames. The worker there is trying to pull the cotton free before the rollers tighten the knot further. Your neighbour leans slightly to watch. Happens, he says calmly. Within seconds, another worker arrives to help. Together they slow the frame just enough to untangle the fibres before restarting the machine. The interruption lasts less than a minute. The rhythm of the room restores itself quickly. Moments like that remind you how delicate the entire operation really is. Hundreds of spindles depend on thin, fragile threads that can snap or tangle at any moment. And yet the machines continue hour after hour. You shift your weight from one foot to the other. The soreness in your legs is becoming more noticeable now. Your neighbour glances at you knowingly. First week always hurts, he says. He flexes his fingers briefly before returning to his own repairs. Over time, workers develop certain habits to manage the strain of factory labour. Small stretches between rows, quick shoulder rolls while waiting for a cone to fill, even subtle shifts in posture to keep muscles from stiffening. None of it removes the fatigue entirely, but it helps. The afternoon light begins creeping through the high windows, now casting pale stripes across the spinning frames. Dust particles float in those beams like slow drifting snow. The sight is strangely beautiful for a moment. Then another thread snaps, pulling your attention back to the task. Tie the thread, guide the fibre, release the tension. The machines continue their endless turning, and somewhere among the hundreds of workers moving through the spinning room, families like the one you just noticed quietly share the same long day together. Mother 2 rows down, child sweeping beneath the machines, another daughter carrying bobbins, all of them working beneath the same humming belts, keeping the threads alive, keeping the wages coming, keeping the household afloat for one more week. By the time the afternoon settles over the spinning room, you begin to notice your body in ways you did not earlier in the day. At sunrise, you were mostly aware of the machines, the noise, the speed, and the unfamiliar rhythm of the work. Now the machines feel almost ordinary compared to the quiet complaints rising from your muscles. Your feet ache first. The wooden floor beneath the spinning frames offers no softness at all. Hour after hour of standing in the same narrow strip beside the machine has slowly pressed the fatigue upward through your legs. You shift your weight slightly from one foot to the other. It helps a little, not much. Your shoulders join the conversation next. Every time you lean forward to catch a broken thread, the same group of muscles tightens again. The motion repeats dozens of times an hour, so gradually that you barely noticed it earlier. Now you feel it. Your neighbour glances over and smiles knowingly. First full day always wakes the body up, he says. He stretches his arms briefly behind his back before returning to his spindles. Workers in 19th century factories often describe this stage of the shift as the moment when the work truly settled into the body. The early hours required attention and concentration. Later in the day, the physical strain became impossible to ignore. The air in the room has grown thicker as well. Warm humidity clings to the skin, and the fine cotton fibres drifting through the room seem more noticeable now. When a beam of sunlight cuts through the high windows, the floating dust becomes visible as tiny white specks suspended in the air. You breathe in and cough softly. A woman 2 rows away pulls a small cloth from her pocket and ties it loosely across her nose and mouth before returning to her work. Some factory workers adopted this simple trick to reduce the amount of lint they inhaled. It was hardly a perfect solution, but it provided a little relief during long shifts. The spinning frames continue turning with their relentless precision. You tie another thread, replace another cone. Your fingers are moving faster now than they did this morning. The machine's rhythm is slowly becoming familiar. Yet the job has other surprises waiting. Across the room, a worker suddenly jerks his hand back from a spindle. He shakes his fingers quickly, wincing slightly before returning to the machine. Your neighbour notices your glance. Caught his skin, he explains. Small injuries like that happen often in places like this. The machinery moves quickly and fingers occasionally brush against spinning parts or metal edges. Reports from factory inspectors in the late 19th century frequently mention minor cuts, burns and bruises as everyday hazards of industrial work. Most were not serious enough to stop the shift, but they added up. Over weeks and months, many workers carried a quiet collection of small scars earned from the machines. You become more cautious with your own hands after witnessing that moment. Your fingers move carefully near the spinning threads, avoiding the faster moving parts whenever possible. A few minutes later, the foreman walks slowly down your row again. He pauses beside one machine where the threads appear slightly uneven. The worker there adjusts the tension wheel, immediately nodding before the foreman even speaks. The message is clear. Keep things running smoothly. Further down the aisle, the boy with the lint pan continues his sweeping. Every few minutes, he crouches beneath the machine frames, gathering the soft white fibres that collect along the floor. His small broom makes quiet brushing sounds that barely rise above the roar of machinery. One unusual detail noted in several early labour reports is that cotton dust could accumulate so quickly inside mills that floors sometimes needed constant sweeping throughout the day. Without it, the fibres might build into thick layers that interfere with machine movement. The boy works steadily. He has probably been doing this for years. You glance toward the windows again. The sunlight has shifted noticeably now, angling deeper into the room. The day outside is moving forward, even if the spinning room feels suspended in a permanent mechanical rhythm. Your stomach tightens slightly. Not hunger this time. Fatigue. The afternoon hours are often the hardest part of the day for factory workers. The energy from the meal break has faded, but the end of the shift is still far away. Some historians studying industrial labour point out that this period of the day produced the most mistakes. Workers grew tired, attention slipped, and threads snapped more often. You make a quiet promise to yourself not to let that happen. Another thread breaks. You catch it quickly. Your fingers twist the fibres together in one smooth motion. Tie, release. Good. Across the aisle, the man with the hidden newspaper glances at you and nods slightly. Perhaps he has noticed your improvement. Even small encouragements feel meaningful in a place like this. The room continues humming with movement. Workers glide up and down the aisles. Trays of bobbins pass from hand to hand. The belts overhead deliver their steady power from the steam engine somewhere deep inside the building. Your shoulders ache again. You roll them once quickly while walking down the row. A few steps later, your neighbour leans closer and speaks quietly. Listen close, he says. You pause and focus on the sound of the machines. At first it seems unchanged, the same endless mechanical roar that has filled the room all day. Then gradually, you notice a slightly uneven rhythm in one of the frames farther down the aisle. A faint stuttering sound interrupts the otherwise smooth hum. There, he says, pointing. You watch as a worker approaches that machine and adjusts one of the rollers. Within seconds, the strange sound disappears. Your neighbour smiles. That's how you know the machines. You nod slowly. It is a strange skill to learn, listening for the personality of steel and spinning cotton. But here among the endless rows of machinery, that knowledge may become one of your most valuable tools. The afternoon continues stretching forward, thread by thread, spindle by spindle. And with every passing minute, your body learns a little more about what it truly costs to stand inside a factory for an entire day. By the time the afternoon begins, leaning toward evening, the spinning room has settled into a deep and steady rhythm that almost feels hypnotic. The machines continue their endless turning. Belts glide over wheels above your head. Threads twist into neat white cones along the rows of frames. Workers move through their aisles with practiced steps that seem timed to the pulse of the machinery. Your body, however, has started keeping a different kind of clock. The soreness in your feet is now a constant companion. It no longer arrives in sharp bursts. Instead, it sits quietly in the background, a dull weight that reminds you how long you have been standing. You shift your weight again. Your neighbour notices. Boots get better after a few weeks, he says, though his smile suggests the statement may contain more hope than certainty. Long hours on hard factory floors were one of the most common complaints recorded by industrial workers of the period. Some employees tried stuffing bits of cloth inside their shoes for extra padding. Others simply grew used to the discomfort over time. Neither option sounds particularly appealing. The afternoon light, creeping through the high windows, now stretches farther across the floor. Dust floats through those beams in slow drifting clouds. The particles glow softly for a moment before vanishing again into the general haze of the room. You glance toward the clock. Still time left. A tray of bobbins passes behind you as the young girl returns again, moving with the quick steps of someone who has repeated the same route all day. She collects the full cones from your machine and replaces them with empty ones without breaking stride. You hand her another spool. Thanks, she says briefly. Her voice is calm but slightly tired. Children working in factories often completed long shifts just like the adults around them. Reformers would later criticise these conditions, strongly arguing that young workers needed time for school and rest rather than hours beside industrial machines. At the time, however many families depended on those small wages to make rent, you watch the girl disappear down the next aisle before returning to your thread repairs. Another snap, tie, release. The motion now feels almost automatic. Across the room, the foreman walks past again, his notebook still in hand. He pauses occasionally to inspect a machine or exchange a few words with a worker before moving on. His slow patrol has become another part of the room's rhythm. Nearby, the boy sweeping lint finishes clearing a small pile beneath the frames. He empties the fibres into a large metal bin at the end of the row. One small detail from mill records of the era mentions that these bins sometimes filled surprisingly fast. Cotton lint collected in astonishing quantities during busy production days. If left unattended, the soft fibres could even become a fire risk. The boy returns to his sweeping route with quiet determination. A few rows away, two workers begin speaking softly while adjusting their machines. You cannot hear their conversation clearly over the noise, but occasional laughter slips through the mechanical roar. Moments like that feel oddly reassuring. Despite the long hours and strict supervision, workers still found ways to share stories, jokes and fragments of ordinary life between the machines. You notice the man with the hidden newspaper again. This time he sneaks a glance at the page while leaning slightly behind his spinning frame. Your neighbour catches the movement and chuckles. He thinks the foreman never sees, he says. Whether the foreman truly ignores it or simply chooses his battles remains unclear. Across the aisle, a woman wipes her hands on a cloth before carefully adjusting several threads at once. Her movements are quick and confident, suggesting years of experience with the same machine. You watch her technique closely. She seems to anticipate the threads breaking before they actually do. The skill fascinates you. Industrial historians often remark that factory workers developed specialised knowledge through repetition. Though the machines belonged to the company, the understanding of how they behaved often belonged to the workers themselves. That knowledge passed quietly from one employee to another, sometimes with words, sometimes simply through observation. You catch another thread before it snaps fully this time, tightening the fibre slightly before it tangles. Your neighbour nods approvingly. Getting the hang of it, he says. The compliment feels small but meaningful. A bell rings somewhere beyond the spinning room. Not the final whistle yet. Just another time signal marking the slow progress of the shift. The sound echoes faintly through the building before disappearing beneath the roar of the machinery again. You glance once more toward the windows. The colour of the light has changed. The bright white of midday has softened into a pale golden tone that creeps across the machines and workers alike. Shadows stretch longer across the floor. Even inside this noisy room, the outside world continues turning quietly. You tie another thread, replace another cone, step down the row, repeat. Fatigue pulls gently at your shoulders, but the rhythm of the work carries you forward. Across the spinning room, families still work within sight of each other. The boy sweeping lint pauses briefly near the woman your neighbour pointed out earlier. She glances down at him and nods once before returning to her machine. The exchange lasts only a second, but it carries a quiet understanding. Another hour passes slowly. The machines show no sign of slowing. Yet somewhere deep in the building, the great steam engine continues turning, feeding power into the belts above your head. And every worker in this room waits for the same sound. The long whistle that will finally signal the end of the day. Until then, the threads must keep spinning. The machines must keep running. And you must keep standing beside them. The spinning room continues its steady roar, yet something about the late afternoon begins to change the mood among the workers. You notice it first in the way people glance toward the high windows more often. The sunlight has shifted again, turning warmer and softer as it slips through the dusty glass. Long beams stretch across the spinning frames and the moving belts above. The floating cotton fibres glow in those beams like tiny drifting stars. Even the machines seem slightly calmer in this light, though, of course, they are doing exactly the same work they have done all day. Your own body is now deeply aware of the passing hours. Your feet still ache, but the sensation has changed. Instead of sharp discomfort, it feels more like a heavy pressure spreading through your legs. Your shoulders carry a slow burning stiffness from leaning toward the machines again and again. You stretch briefly while walking to the next spindle. Your neighbour notices. Almost there, he says. You follow his gaze toward the clock. Not quite yet. Still time before the final whistle. The afternoon stretch of a factory shift often required a particular kind of patience. Workers knew the end of the day was approaching, but the machines demanded the same attention they had required since morning. Another thread snaps. Your hands move quickly. Tie, guide, release. The repair is smooth now. The woman across the aisle glances over and gives you a small approving smile. It is the kind of silent encouragement that workers in crowded factories often exchanged. No time for long conversation, but a quick nod can say enough. Further down the row, the young girl with the bobbin tray continues her rounds. She walks a little slower now than she did earlier in the day, though her movements remain careful and precise. She collects a group of full cones from another machine and carries them toward a large wooden crate at the end of the aisle. Industrial production in textile mills depended on this constant cycle. Raw cotton entered the factory in large compressed bales. After passing through cleaning, carding, spinning and weaving processes, it gradually transformed into finished cloth. Each room in the building handled a different stage of that transformation. You are standing in one of the earliest steps, turning loose fibres into thread. A small incident interrupts your thoughts. A cone slips from a worker's hands and rolls across the floor between two machines. The wooden spool spins in a slow circle before stopping against a metal support beam. The worker retrieves it quickly, brushing off the dust before returning it to the frame. Minor accidents like this happen frequently in crowded workrooms. Most of the time they were harmless. Still, everyone remains alert. The machines never stop moving. Your neighbour suddenly tilts his head slightly. Listen, he says. You pause and focus on the sounds around you. At first everything seems normal. The belts whip overhead. Spindles spin along the frames. Workers move through the aisles with quiet determination. Then you notice a subtle difference in the tone of one machine down the row. A faint clicking sound interrupts the otherwise smooth hum. A worker approaches the frame and adjusts one of the rollers. The sound disappears almost instantly. Your neighbour smiles. Machines talk if you pay attention. The idea seems strange at first, but the longer you stand here, the more it begins to make sense. Experienced workers often recognise trouble by sound long before a machine actually failed. Slight changes in vibration or rhythm could signal a loose belt, uneven tension, or a worn gear. That awareness saved time and prevented costly delays. Across the room, the foreman walks past again, though his pace appears slightly less urgent now. He stops briefly to examine a machine near the far wall, scribbles something in his notebook, then continues his slow patrol. Supervision remained constant throughout the day, yet even four men seemed aware that the end of the shift was approaching. Workers glanced toward the windows more frequently now. The light outside is fading gradually. Another bell rings, somewhere beyond the spinning room. Its tone echoes faintly through the building before dissolving into the noise of the machines. Your neighbour nods. Last hour. Those two words carry a quiet wave of relief through your mind. The final stretch begins. You move carefully along your row, determined not to make mistakes now. Fatigue can easily lead to broken threads or tangled fibres. Some labour historians studying factory records suggest that productivity sometimes dipped slightly during the final hour of long shifts. Workers grew tired and concentration became harder to maintain. You try not to become part of that statistic. Another thread breaks. Tie. Release. A few minutes later, another cone fills completely. You replace it with steady hands. The young girl returns again, collecting finished spools. Nearly done, she says softly as she takes the tray. You nod. Even the small tasks seem lighter now that the end of the day is visible on the horizon. The room continues humming with activity. Workers still move briskly between the machines, though a subtle change in posture is noticeable. People stand a little straighter. Heads lift slightly more often. Everyone is listening for the same sound. The final whistle. Outside the windows, the sky has begun turning pale gold and grey. Evening is settling slowly over the town, beyond the factory walls. Inside, however, the spinning frames remain busy, thread by thread, spindle by spindle, until at last the machines will receive permission to rest, and the workers beside them will finally step away from the noise. For now, the final hour stretches ahead, but the promise of the whistle grows closer with every passing minute. The final hour begins in a strange state of anticipation. Nothing about the spinning room actually changes. The machines continue turning at the same steady pace. Belts glide along their wheels above your head, and the endless rows of spindles keep twisting cotton into thin white thread. Yet every worker seems slightly more aware of time now. You notice it in the way people glance toward the tall clock more often. Even those who have barely looked up all day seem to check it occasionally. Your own body feels the shift as well. Fatigue presses heavily through your legs and shoulders, but it is now mixed with something else. Expectation. You repair another broken thread and move down the row. Your fingers work almost automatically now. The small tasks that felt awkward this morning have begun settling into muscle memory. Tie the fibres. Guide the strand. Release. Across the aisle, the woman who nodded to you earlier adjusts several spindles at once. With remarkable speed, she barely pauses before moving on to the next section. Workers with years of experience often developed astonishing efficiency with these machines. Observers writing about American textile mills frequently remarked that skilled operators could manage dozens of spindles simultaneously without appearing rushed. You watch her technique carefully for a moment, then return to your own section. Another cone fills. You replace it smoothly. Nearby, the young girl, carrying the bobbin trays, pauses briefly to stretch her arms before lifting another stack of spools. The tray must weigh more than it appears. She notices you watching. Arms feel longer by the end of the day, she says with a tired grin. You can imagine, factory shifts often stretch 10 hours or more, depending on the industry and location. Records from labour organisations in the late 19th century show that many workers spent the majority of their waking lives inside buildings just like this one. The long hours were one of the most common complaints voiced by industrial labourers across the country. Still, the machines demanded consistency. You hear a faint scraping sound beneath one of the frames, and glance down to see the boy with the sweeping pan again. He carefully gathers another pile of cotton lint into his bin. His small broom moves quickly across the floor. One small but interesting detail mentioned in several factory reports is that cotton lint sometimes accumulated so quickly during busy shifts that sweeping had to be done almost continuously. Without it, the fibres could drift into gears or belts and cause mechanical trouble. The boy empties his pan and moves to the next aisle. Your neighbour watches him for a moment. Fast worker, he says. The comment carries quiet approval. A few minutes later, the foreman appears again, walking slowly along the row. His notebook remains tucked under one arm as he studies the machines and workers with careful attention. He stops beside a frame where the thread cones are filling unevenly. The worker there adjusts the tension wheel immediately. The foreman nods and continues walking. Supervision like this was common in large factories. Management relied on foremen to monitor productivity and keep machines running smoothly throughout the day. How strict these supervisors actually were varied from one workplace to another. Some modern historians believe certain foremen ruled their rooms with near absolute authority, while others argue that experienced workers often negotiated quiet understandings that allowed the day to run more smoothly. From where you stand, the foreman seems both watchful and practical. He rarely raises his voice, but his presence is never ignored. Another bell rings somewhere beyond the spinning room. Its tone echoes briefly through the corridors before dissolving into the mechanical roar. Your neighbour glances toward the clock again. 40 minutes, he says. You nod. The final stretch. You move carefully along your row, focusing on each spindle. Fatigue can easily cause mistakes near the end of the shift. Across the aisle, the man with the folded newspaper sneaks another quick look at the sports page before tucking it away again. Your neighbour chuckles quietly. Still chasing that baseball score, he says. Small rituals like that help pass the time. Another thread snaps. You catch it quickly. Tie. Release. The repair is smooth. You feel a small spark of satisfaction. Earlier in the day, that same task would have taken longer. Now your hands know what to do almost without thinking. Industrial work often created this kind of transformation. Repetition gradually turned unfamiliar tasks into practiced habits. You glance toward the windows again. The sky outside has begun shifting toward evening colours. The sunlight entering the room now glows warmer and deeper, stretching long shadows between the spinning frames. Dust particles drift slowly through the golden beams. For a brief moment, the spinning room almost looks peaceful. Then another belt snaps against its wheel above your head, and the mechanical roar reminds you exactly where you are. A few rows away, two workers quietly compare the number of cones they have finished today. Their voices rise just enough to carry across the machines. Friendly competition was not unusual among experienced workers. Some took pride in how efficiently they could manage their section of frames. You focus again on your own machine. Tie another thread. Replace another cone. Step forward. The rhythm continues. Gradually, the room begins to change in small ways. People stand a little straighter. More heads turn toward the clock. Even the foreman glances up once. The entire room seems to be listening, waiting. And then suddenly the sound arrives. The long whistle blasts from the roof of the factory, echoing across the spinning room, with a piercing cry that cuts cleanly through the roar of the machines. For a brief second, nobody moves. Then workers step back from their frames, almost in unison. The shift is over. The whistle still echoes faintly in your ears as the machines begin to slow. It does not happen all at once. The spinning frames continue turning for a short moment, while the belts overhead gradually lose their speed. The great engine somewhere deep inside the building is easing down, and the power that has filled the room all day begins to fade. One by one, the spindles stop spinning. The noise that has surrounded you for hours slowly collapses into a strange and unfamiliar quiet. You had almost forgotten what silence feels like. Workers step back from their machines, stretching stiff arms and rolling tired shoulders. Some rub their hands together as if waking their fingers after a long sleep. Your own ears buzz softly from the sudden absence of sound. Your neighbour exhales with quiet satisfaction. Another day, he says. Around the room, people begin tidying their stations. A few gather finished cones into crates. Others wipe down the metal frames or sweep loose cotton fibres into piles along the floor. In many factories, the end of the shift included a brief period of cleanup. Maintaining the machines and keeping the work areas clear help prepare the room for the next day's production. You brush a thin layer of lint from your coat sleeve. It floats gently to the floor like soft snow. The young girl who carried the bobbin trays sets her empty basket against the wall and stretches both arms above her head. Her shoulders crack softly as she relaxes for the first time all day. The boy with the sweeping pan finishes collecting the last small pile of cotton fibres and empties them into the large bin. For a moment he simply leans on his broom, breathing slowly. The room now hums with quiet conversation instead of machinery. Workers compare small details of the day. Broken threads, stubborn machines. The number of cones finish before the whistle. A man across the aisle pulls off his cap and runs his hand through sweat-flattened hair. Hot one today, he says to no one in particular. The woman who had been working beside him nods. Summer's coming. The exchange is brief but friendly. Factory floors could be strict places during working hours. Yet the moments after the machine stopped often allowed workers to speak more freely. Your neighbour gathers a few tools from a small shelf beside the frame and places them neatly in a wooden drawer. You glance toward the foreman. He stands near the centre of the room, checking his notebook one last time. A few workers approach him briefly, asking questions or mentioning small mechanical issues that might need attention before morning. Supervisors often used these final minutes to review the day's work and prepare instructions for the next shift. Eventually he closes the notebook and nods toward the door. The signal is clear. Time to leave. A steady stream of workers begins moving toward the corridor. Boots scrape lightly across the wooden floor as people collect coats, lunch pails, and small personal belongings. You follow the flow toward the exit. The corridor feels surprisingly quiet after the roar of the spinning room. Conversations echo softly against the brick walls as groups of workers walk toward the outer doors. The smell of machine oil fades, gradually replaced by the cooler air drifting in from outside. As you approach the main entrance, the evening light greets you like a gentle reward. The sky above the factory yard glows with soft orange and grey colours. The tall smokestack continues, releasing a thin trail of smoke, but the yard itself is filling with workers heading home in every direction. Some walk quickly, eager for supper and rest. Others linger in small groups, finishing conversations that were impossible during the shift. Your legs feel strangely light now that the machines are silent, yet the fatigue remains. You can feel it in the slow stiffness of your knees and the dull heaviness in your shoulders. Many accounts from factory workers in the late 19th century describe this moment of stepping outside after a long shift as one of the most satisfying parts of the day. The sudden return of fresh air and open space felt almost luxurious after hours in crowded workrooms. You take a slow breath. The air smells of coal smoke and evening cooking fires from nearby houses. A few wagons rattle down the street carrying crates away from the loading dock. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks as workers pass along the sidewalk. Your neighbour steps beside you again. Heading toward the boarding houses, he asks. You nod. Several of the workers you recognise from the spinning room begin walking the same direction. The streets around the factory quickly fill with small groups moving toward different neighbourhoods. Factory towns often grew in tight clusters around the mills themselves. Housing for workers was usually built close enough that people could walk to their shifts each morning. Some buildings belonged to the factory owners. Others were run by private landlords who rented rooms to newly arrived labourers. You walk slowly down the street, letting the evening air cool your skin. Behind you, the factory stands like a giant shadow against the fading sky. The windows reflect the last light of the day, though the machines inside have already come to rest. A curious little observation made by several writers of the period is that factory towns often grew unusually quiet in the hour after the whistle. So many people worked the same schedule that entire neighbourhoods seemed to pause briefly while workers returned home. You notice the effect now. Shops begin lighting their lamps. Doors open as families welcome tired workers inside. Somewhere down the street, a piano begins playing a simple melody through an open window. Your neighbour nods toward a row of narrow brick buildings ahead. Boarding house is there, he says. You follow him along the sidewalk. Your body feels heavy now, the fatigue finally settling fully into your muscles. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there is also a quiet sense of accomplishment. You survived your first full day beside the machines. And tomorrow morning, when the whistle calls again, the factory will expect you to return. You walk slowly with the small stream of workers, moving away from the factory gates. The evening air feels cooler now, carrying the mixed smells of coal, smoke, street dust, and cooking suppers drifting from nearby houses. After the long hours inside the spinning room, the open sky feels strangely wide. Your legs are tired, but they continue forward almost by habit. Beside you, your neighbour walks with the calm pace of someone who has repeated this journey many hundreds of times. The street ahead is lined with narrow buildings whose windows are beginning to glow with lamplight. These houses fill up fast, he says, nodding toward the row ahead. Boarding houses were one of the most common living arrangements for factory workers during the industrial expansion of the late 19th century. Many new arrivals to mill towns did not yet own homes, so they rented small rooms in crowded houses run by landlords or widows who cooked shared meals for the tenants. You reach the building your neighbour pointed out. From the outside, it looks modest but sturdy. 3 floors of brick narrow windows and a wooden door that swings open as another group of workers enters ahead of you. Inside the hallway is warm and slightly noisy. Voices drift from several rooms. Someone laughs loudly somewhere upstairs. The smell of boiling potatoes and onions fills the air. Your neighbour leads you into a dining room where a long wooden table stretches across the centre of the space. Several workers have already taken seats along the benches. A woman stands near the stove stirring a large pot. Evening, she says, as more people enter. Boarding house meals were usually simple but filling. Workers needed affordable food after long shifts, and most houses served the same dishes repeatedly throughout the week. Tonight, the meal appears to be thick vegetable stew with bread. You take a seat beside your neighbour as bowls are passed down the table. For a few minutes, the room grows quiet as everyone begins eating. After hours beside roaring machines, the calm rhythm of spoons against bowls feels almost peaceful. Across the table, 2 men begin discussing the factory's weaving department. One claims the looms broke down twice earlier in the afternoon. The other insists the problem was fixed before noon. Conversations like these were common in worker housing. Different departments inside a factory often had their own reputations and rivalries. You listen while finishing your stew. The warmth of the food slowly spreads through your tired body. Another worker sets down his spoon and stretches his back with a quiet groan. Long shift today, he mutters. Most textile mills during this period ran long work days that could stretch 10 hours or more depending on demand. Labour reformers were already beginning to argue for shorter hours, but widespread changes would take decades to arrive. For now, the long day remains the standard. One small but interesting detail remembered by many workers is that boarding house tables often served as unofficial meeting places where people exchanged news. Job openings, rent changes, and rumours about factory policies frequently circulated over these shared meals. You hear a few of those rumours tonight. Someone claims the company may install newer machines next year. Another insists that wages in a nearby town are slightly higher. Your neighbour shrugs. Rumours travel faster than trains, he says quietly. After supper, most of the workers lean back in their chairs, enjoying the rare stillness that follows a full meal. The room grows louder again as conversation returns. One man describes a baseball game he attended the previous Sunday. Another tells a story about nearly missing the morning whistle earlier in the week. Laughter spreads briefly along the table. Moments like this remind you that factory workers built communities around their shared routines. Even after exhausting shifts, people gather to talk, joke, and compare experiences. You stand after finishing your bowl and follow your neighbour toward the staircase. The steps creak softly as several workers climb to the upper floors. The hallway upstairs is narrow, with a row of simple wooden doors on either side. Your neighbour stops at one of them and opens it. The room inside is small but clean. 2 narrow beds stand against opposite walls. A single window looks out toward the factory district where the tall smokestack is still visible against the fading sky. "This one's yours," he says, pointing to the empty bed. You set your coat down and sit on the edge of the mattress. Your legs immediately welcome the chance to rest. Another detail recorded in several personal accounts from factory towns is that many boarding house residents shared rooms with co-workers. Privacy was limited, but the arrangement helped reduce rent costs. The window is slightly open, letting cool evening air drift into the room. Outside you can hear faint sounds of the town settling into night. A wagon rattles across the street. Someone closes a door nearby. Your neighbour sits on his bed and begins removing his boots slowly. "First day done," he says. You nod. The words carry quiet significance. Your muscles ache in ways they never did before this morning, yet you also feel a strange sense of accomplishment. You lasted. Not everyone did. Some new workers left after only a few days when the hours proved too exhausting or the machines too unforgiving. Your neighbour stretches his arms and lies back against his pillow. "Best sleep you'll have in weeks," he says. He might be right. Your body already feels heavy with fatigue. Outside the window, the factory stands silent now, its machines resting until the morning whistle calls workers back again. For tonight, however, the spinning frames are still, and you are finally allowed to rest as well. Night settles gradually over the boarding house, though the building never becomes completely quiet. You lie on the narrow bed, staring up at the pale ceiling while the sounds of the house drift softly through the walls. A door closes somewhere down the hallway. Someone laughs faintly from the kitchen below. Floorboards creak as another worker climbs the stairs. The long day inside the spinning room still lingers in your body. Your shoulders ache in a slow, steady way. Your legs feel heavy from standing hour after hour beside the machines. Even your ears carry a faint echo of the factory's roar, like the distant hum of a storm that has not quite passed. Your neighbour notices you shifting slightly on the mattress. "First nights are strange," he says quietly from the other bed. You turn your head toward him. "Strange how—" He chuckles softly. "You still hear the machines?" You pause and listen. At first there is only the quiet breathing of the house. But after a moment you realise he is right. Somewhere in the back of your mind, the rhythm of spinning frames and belts continues repeating. A phantom factory still running inside your head. Many former mill workers later describe this same experience. After long shifts surrounded by mechanical noise, the mind sometimes continued replaying the sounds even after the machines had stopped. The effect usually faded after sleep. You hope so. Outside the window, the town has grown darker. A few lanterns glow along the street, casting soft circles of light on the dirt road below. The tall smokestack of the factory is still visible against the dim sky. For a place that dominated the entire day, the building now looks strangely quiet. Your neighbour rolls onto his side. "You'll get used to it," he says. That phrase seems to follow factory life everywhere. You will get used to the noise. You will get used to the hours. You will get used to the aching muscles. Perhaps he is right. You close your eyes for a moment, letting your body sink deeper into the mattress. Downstairs, the boarding house landlady finishes washing dishes in the kitchen. The faint clatter of plates and water drifting through the pipes echoes up the staircase. Shared living spaces like this one formed an important part of many factory communities. Workers who arrived alone in new towns often depended on boarding houses for both housing and companionship. The arrangement was not luxurious, but it offered warmth, meals, and a place to sleep. You hear footsteps in the hallway as another tenant passes your door. Someone yawns loudly. Another door creaks open and shut. Gradually, the sounds begin fading as people settle into their beds. Your neighbour's breathing slows. Within minutes, he is asleep. You remain awake a little longer, watching the faint glow of moonlight along the window frame. The town outside continues its quiet nighttime rhythm. A wagon rolls slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoes across the valley. Railroads played a major role in the industrial expansion of the United States during the late 19th century. Factories depended on trains to deliver raw materials like cotton and to carry finished goods to markets across the country. The distant whistle reminds you that the world beyond this town is always moving. Inside the boarding house, however, the night grows still. Your eyelids begin to grow heavy. Just as sleep begins to arrive, a sudden shout echoes faintly from the street below. You sit up slightly. Two men are arguing outside a nearby saloon. Their voices carry through the open window before fading again as they walk farther down the road. Your neighbour stirs briefly but does not wake. Factory towns often had lively streets after the workday ended. Saloons, music halls, and small shops attracted workers looking for a brief escape from long shifts. Some people spent their evenings in quiet boarding houses like this one. Others preferred louder company. You lie back again and pull the thin blanket over your chest. Your muscles finally begin to relax. Yet another thought crosses your mind. How many days like this stretch ahead? Modern historians often discuss the question of endurance when studying factory workers of the industrial age. Some scholars suggest that many labourers viewed these difficult conditions as temporary steps toward better opportunities. Others believe large numbers simply adapted because alternatives were limited. The truth probably varied from person to person. For now, the only certainty is tomorrow morning. The whistle will sound again, the machines will wake, and the spinning room will expect you to return. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, the boarding house grows quieter with every passing minute. The faint mechanical rhythm in your mind finally begins fading, replaced by the slow comfort of sleep. Outside the window, the factory stands silent beneath the moonlight. Inside your small room, exhaustion finally wins. Your first full day as a factory worker in industrial America comes to a quiet end. Morning arrives sooner than your body would prefer. At first, it is only a faint grey light creeping through the thin curtains beside your bed. The room still feels wrapped in sleep. Your muscles remain heavy from the long shift of the previous day, and for a moment you forget exactly where you are. Then the factory whistle sounds. The sharp cry cuts through the quiet morning air and slides straight through the open window. Your eyes open instantly. Across the room, your neighbour groans softly and sits upright, rubbing his face with both hands. The whistle fades, leaving behind the echo of its command. Time to begin again. You swing your legs slowly off the bed. The floorboards feel cool beneath your feet, and your legs protest briefly as you stand. The soreness from yesterday has not disappeared overnight. Your neighbour stretches his arms above his head. Second day's easier, he says with quiet optimism. You hope he is right. Downstairs, the boarding house is already stirring. Doors open along the hallway as workers step into the corridor, tying boots and fastening coats. Someone coughs in the stairwell. Another person laughs quietly while descending towards the kitchen. You follow your neighbour down the narrow staircase. The smell of breakfast greets you before you even reach the dining room. Porridge, thick, warm and simple. The landlady moves between the stove and the table, setting bowls in front of each worker who sits down. The long wooden table fills quickly with tired but hungry people. Morning meals in worker housing were rarely elaborate. Many accounts from the period describe breakfasts consisting of porridge bread and occasionally eggs when they were affordable. The goal was not luxury, it was energy. You take a seat and begin eating slowly. The warmth spreads through your stomach in a comforting way. Across the table, two workers discuss the weather while glancing occasionally toward the windows. Cold this morning, one says. Won't last, replies the other. These small conversations help shake away the last traces of sleep. Your neighbour finishes his bowl and stands. Better move, he says. The second whistle will sound soon. You step outside into the pale light of early morning. The street is already filling with workers heading toward the factory gates. Boots crunch along the dirt road. Breath drifts in faint clouds in the cool air. The town feels strangely synchronized. Entire blocks of houses empty at nearly the same moment as people begin their walk to work. Observers writing about industrial towns often noted this remarkable daily migration. At certain hours, the streets filled almost entirely with workers moving toward the mills, and later in the day the same crowds flowed home again. The factory truly controlled the rhythm of the community. You join the moving line of people heading down the street. Your muscles warm gradually as you walk. Ahead, the tall brick walls of the factory rise once again against the brightening sky. Smoke curls lazily from the stack, signalling that the boilers are already awake. Somewhere inside, the great steam engine is beginning to turn. Your neighbour glances toward the building. She's hungry already, he says. The phrase makes you smile slightly. To many workers, the factory felt almost like a living creature. The machines demanded constant attention and energy, and the building seemed to swallow hundreds of people every morning before releasing them again in the evening. You approach the gate with the growing crowd. The guard stands beside his desk, just as he did yesterday. Workers pass through steadily, some nodding and greeting as they enter. Inside the yard, the familiar smells of coal smoke and machine oil greet you again. You step through the door and into the corridor. The distant rumble of machinery is already building somewhere beyond the walls. Another interesting detail appears in many personal accounts from factory workers. After only a few days, the sounds and smells that once seemed overwhelming often became oddly comforting. They signal routine, stability, the promise of wages at the end of the week. You walk down the hallway beside your neighbour, boots echoing softly on the brick floor. The spinning room door stands open ahead. Even before you enter, the sound of the machines reaches you, belts spinning, spindles turning, the endless mechanical rhythm that fills the room each day. Workers step inside one by one, moving toward their assigned machines. You take your place beside the spinning frame you worked yesterday. Your hands rest briefly on the cool metal rail. The machine hums steadily, ready for another full day of production. Across the aisle, the woman from yesterday nods in greeting. The young girl with the bobbin tray passes by carrying her first load of empty spools. The boy with the sweeping pan begins his route beneath the machines. Everything looks almost exactly the same, and yet something inside you feels slightly different. Yesterday the room felt overwhelming. Today it feels familiar. Industrial life often depended on this gradual process of adjustment. Workers learned the rhythms of machines, the expectations of supervisors, and the pace of long shifts. Little by little, the factory became part of daily life. The foreman walks down the aisle and checks his watch. A moment later, the machines surge fully into motion. The belts tighten. The spindles accelerate. The roar of the spinning room returns. Your second day has begun. The second day inside the spinning room begins with a different feeling in your chest. Yesterday, everything seemed loud, confusing, and unpredictable. Today, the same room greets you like a place you almost understand. The roar of the machines still fills the air, but your mind no longer struggles to separate the sounds. You can already hear the steady rhythm of your own row of spindles. Your hands begin moving almost immediately. Check the thread. Guide the fibre, replace the cone, tie the brake. The work that felt awkward only a day ago now flows more smoothly through your fingers. Across the aisle, the woman who nodded to you yesterday moves through her row with the calm confidence of someone who has done this thousands of times. When a thread snaps, she repairs it in a motion so quick it almost disappears. You try to imitate that speed. Your neighbour notices. Careful, he says, with a small grin. Speed comes after practice. You nod and slow slightly. The machines reward steady hands more than reckless ones. Many experienced factory workers believed that patience during the first weeks was essential. Learning the rhythm of the machines mattered more than racing through tasks. A thread breaks again. This time you catch it before the loose strand tangles with its neighbours. Tie, release. Good. The spinning frame continues turning without interruption. The girl with the bobbin tray passes your row again, her steps quick and balanced as she collects the finished cones. She nods when you hand her the spools. "Faster today," she says. You feel a quiet sense of pride. Nearby, the boy sweeping lint continues his careful work beneath the machines. His broom slides along the floor, collecting the drifting fibres before they gather in larger piles. Cotton dust remained a constant presence in textile mills of this era. Reports written by factory inspectors often mentioned the challenge of keeping floors clear, while hundreds of spinning threads released fine particles into the air. Without frequent sweeping, the fibres could accumulate quickly. The boy empties his pan into the bin and moves to the next aisle. Your neighbour leans closer while adjusting his spindles. "You ever hear about the strike in Lowell?" he asks. You shake your head. He continues working as he talks, his fingers never pausing. "Years ago, workers walked out when they cut wages. Whole mills shut down for days." Labour protests like that had begun appearing in industrial towns across the United States by the late 19th century. Workers sometimes organised strikes to demand better pay, shorter hours, or safer conditions. Not every strike succeeded, but the idea of collective action slowly spread through factory communities. Across the room, the foreman walks between the rows, again notebook tucked under his arm. He stops beside one machine and adjusts a small lever himself before writing something down. Supervisors often served as the link between management and the workers on the factory floor. They were responsible for keeping production steady while also reporting problems to higher officials. Your neighbour watches him briefly. "Depends on the man," he says quietly. "Some fair, some not." That difference could shape the entire atmosphere of a factory room. Another thread snaps. You repair it smoothly. The woman across the aisle gives you another approving glance before returning to her own work. The machines continue humming with steady determination. Belts glide across the wheels above your head, powered by the great steam engine hidden deep inside the building. The entire room vibrates gently with that constant mechanical energy. You notice something interesting as the morning progresses. Your body is adjusting. The soreness from yesterday has not vanished, but your muscles seem to understand the movements better. Lean forward, step along the row, reach for the cone, turn back again. The motions feel less exhausting than before. Some historians studying industrial labour point out that the human body adapted surprisingly quickly to repetitive factory work. Within weeks, many workers developed endurance that allowed them to perform the same motions hour after hour. The adjustment was not always comfortable, but it was effective. Across the aisle, the man with the hidden newspaper slips another glance at his sports page while pretending to check a spindle. Your neighbour chuckles quietly, still chasing the score. Even small distractions like that help the hours move along. The bell rings once somewhere down the corridor, marking another piece of the morning shift. The sound echoes faintly before dissolving into the roar of machinery again. You glance briefly toward the high windows. Sunlight is beginning to brighten the glass. Another day is unfolding beyond the factory walls. Inside the spinning room, however, the rhythm remains the same. Tie the thread, replace the cone, step along the row, repeat. Your hands move faster now, guided by the memory of yesterday's lessons. The machine beside you seems less mysterious with every passing minute. It still demands attention, but it no longer feels like an enemy. Instead, it has become something closer to a demanding partner, one that expects you to keep pace. And this morning, for the first time, you feel ready to do exactly that. The morning hours pass with surprising speed once the machines settle into their steady rhythm. You notice the difference almost immediately. Yesterday, every minute inside the spinning room seemed long and demanding. Today the work flows more smoothly and the sound of the machines no longer overwhelms your thoughts. Your hands move confidently along the row of spindles. Check the thread, guide the fibre, replace the cone, tie the brake. The routine has begun to settle into your muscles. Across the aisle, the woman who has been working beside you since yesterday moves down her section with quiet efficiency. She rarely looks hurried, yet her machine runs almost perfectly. You watch her closely for a moment. She seems to sense when a thread is about to snap even before it happens. Her fingers are already moving toward the spindle just as the fibre begins to loosen. Your neighbour notices your curiosity. Years of practice, he says. He lifts a full cone from his machine and replaces it with another empty spool. Workers who stayed in the same mill for long periods often developed remarkable familiarity with their equipment. Contemporary factory reports frequently noted that skilled operators could maintain dozens of spindles with very few interruptions. The machines demanded attention, but experienced workers learned to anticipate their needs. The girl with the bobbin tray returns along the aisle carrying a stack of empty spools. She moves quickly between the machines, collecting finished cones and dropping new ones into place. Her steps are careful near the belts above and the frames below. Years of repetition have taught her exactly where to place each foot. Your neighbour nods toward her. Been here since she was small, he says quietly. Young workers were common in many mills during this period. Families often relied on several members earning wages at once, and factory jobs were one of the few opportunities available in growing industrial towns. You hand the girl another cone. She smiles briefly before continuing down the row. Beneath the machines, the boy with the sweeping pan continues his steady route. His broom glides across the floor, gathering cotton lint into small drifting piles. An interesting note from early mill safety reports explains that cotton fibres floating through the air could create serious problems if allowed to gather too heavily near machinery. Regular sweeping helped reduce the risk of jams or even fires. The boy empties his pan and moves on. Across the room, a sudden ripple of raised voices draws your attention. Two workers are speaking sharply near one of the frames. Their conversation grows tense for a moment before the foreman steps between them. He says a few quiet words. The men nod reluctantly and return to their machines. Disagreements sometimes appeared on crowded factory floors where long hours and difficult work tested everyone's patience. Supervisors often stepped in quickly to restore order before small arguments interrupted production. Your neighbour shakes his head slightly. Too tired for fighting, he mutters. The spinning frames continue turning. Belts glide across their wheels above your head, powered by the great engine deep inside the factory. The constant vibration beneath your boots reminds you that hundreds of machines are working together across the building. You pause briefly to stretch your shoulders while walking along the row. The soreness from yesterday still lingers, though it feels less severe this morning. Many labour historians studying the industrial workforce have suggested that the human body adapted surprisingly quickly to repetitive mechanical work. Within weeks, many new employees could endure long shifts that initially seemed impossible. Other researchers caution that this adaptation came with hidden costs, including fatigue that accumulated slowly over months or years. You suspect both ideas might be true. Another thread snaps. Your fingers catch it almost instantly. Tie. Release. The machine continues spinning without hesitation. Across the aisle, the man with the folded newspaper slips another quick glance at the sports page before tucking it back inside the frame. Your neighbour laughs quietly. He'll know the final score before the rest of the town. Small habits like that provide moments of distraction during long shifts. The bell rings somewhere beyond the spinning room. Workers glance toward the clock, briefly before returning to their machines. The day continues moving forward piece by piece. Sunlight brightens the high windows along the far wall. Dust particles drift slowly through the beams of light, turning the air into a faint golden haze. For a moment, the spinning room almost feels calm. Then a belt snaps sharply above your head, and the familiar roar of machinery fills the space again. You move steadily along your row, tie another thread, replace another cone, step forward, repeat. Your neighbour glances toward you and nods approvingly. Not bad for a second day, he says. The compliment carries quiet weight. You realise something important. Yesterday, the factory felt like a storm you were struggling to survive. Today it feels like a place where you might actually belong. The machines continue humming around you, and the long rhythm of factory life carries you forward into another hour of work. By the middle of the afternoon on your second day, the spinning room feels both familiar and strangely endless. The machines continue their steady humming, the same sound that filled your ears yesterday and earlier this morning. Belts glide across their wheels overhead, while rows of spindles twist cotton into thread with tireless precision. The rhythm has settled deep into the room. You move down your row with steady steps, checking each spindle in turn. Guide the fibre, tie the brake, replace the cone. The motions come faster now. Your hands still ache occasionally, but they no longer hesitate. The machine beside you feels less like a puzzle and more like a routine companion demanding steady attention. Across the aisle, the experienced woman continues her work with quiet concentration. She pauses briefly to adjust the tension on one spindle before moving along to the next. Your neighbour glances toward her. 20 years here, he says. The number surprises you. Many people imagine factory workers moving constantly between jobs, yet records from several textile towns reveal that some employees remained in the same mills for decades. Once workers mastered the machines and built connections in the community, stability could become valuable. Of course, not everyone stayed. Factory work carried its share of risks. You notice one of those risks again a few rows away. A young man suddenly jerks his arm backward after brushing a moving spindle. He shakes his hand quickly and wipes his fingers on his apron before continuing his work. The motion is quick but noticeable. Small injuries like that happened often around fast-moving machinery. Even careful workers occasionally misjudge the distance between their hands and the spinning parts. Many personal accounts written by former mill workers mention the small cuts and scrapes that accumulated over years beside the machines. Most were minor, but they served as constant reminders to stay alert. The boy sweeping lint passes your row again, pushing the soft white fibres into his pan. He hums quietly to himself as he works. An interesting habit remembered by several workers involves singing or humming during long shifts. Though the machines were loud, simple tunes, helped some employees keep their spirits up while repeating the same motions hour after hour. The boy empties the lint into the large bin and continues along the next aisle. Nearby, the girl carrying bobbin trays returns once more. She lifts a full stack of cones from your frame and replaces them with empty spools. "You're keeping up today," she says with a quick smile. You nod, trying. Across the room, the foreman continues his slow patrol, pausing occasionally to check the performance of different machines. His notebook appears again in his hand as he records a few observations. Supervisors relied heavily on these notes to track production and identify mechanical issues. Small details such as repeated thread breaks or uneven spindles could affect an entire day's output. Your neighbour watches him briefly. "Not the worst foreman," he says. His tone suggests that other factories might not be as fortunate. The afternoon hours continue stretching forward. Sunlight moves gradually across the high windows, turning the floating cotton dust into bright specks of light. The warm glow softens the rows of machinery and the tired faces of the workers. For a moment, the spinning room almost resembles a quiet snowfall. Then another thread snaps, and the moment disappears. You repair it quickly. Tie. Release. The machine hums smoothly again. Some scholars studying industrial communities have long debated whether factory workers found satisfaction in mastering their machines or simply endured the work because wages were necessary for survival. Evidence from letters and diaries suggests that both experiences existed side by side. Some workers took pride in their skill, others counted the minutes until the whistle ended the shift. You suspect many people felt both emotions at different times. A sudden ripple of laughter spreads briefly across one row of machines. You glance over to see the man with the folded newspaper holding it up for two nearby workers. Apparently, the baseball score he has been following all day has finally reached its conclusion. Your neighbour grins. Worth the wait, I suppose. Even inside a factory filled with spinning cotton and roaring belts, small pieces of the outside world still manage to sneak in. You move farther down your row. Your legs feel tired again, though not as sharply as yesterday. The constant standing still weighs on your muscles, but your body has begun adjusting to the routine. Industrial labour demanded exactly this kind of endurance. Workers repeated the same tasks hour after hour, day after day, gradually building both skill and stamina. You tie another thread, replace another cone, step along the row. The machines continue their endless turning. Across the room, the foreman glances toward the clock. The afternoon is slowly moving toward evening once again. You realise something quietly surprising. The spinning room no longer feels like an overwhelming storm of noise and confusion. Instead, it feels like a place with its own rhythm. A rhythm that you are beginning to understand. The afternoon light continues sliding slowly across the spinning room as the hours drift toward evening once again. By now, the sound of the machines feels almost like a steady wind that never stops blowing. The belts above glide across their wheels in constant motion, while the long rows of spindles keep twisting cotton fibres into thin white thread. You move along your section with growing confidence. Check the thread, guide the fibre, replace the cone, tie the brake. The work no longer demands every ounce of your concentration. Your hands seem to understand the movements before your mind even thinks about them. Across the aisle, the woman who has worked here for decades continues tending her machines with quiet precision. She pauses briefly to adjust a spindle, then moves forward again. Your neighbour nods toward her. Some folks say, the machines learn you as much as you learn them, he says. The idea sounds strange at first, yet the longer you spend inside this room, the more believable it seems. Workers who spent years beside the same equipment often developed an almost instinctive understanding of their machines. Old mill records occasionally mention employees who could identify problems simply by listening to subtle changes in the sound of a spinning frame. You begin listening more carefully now. At first, the noise blends together into one enormous mechanical roar, but if you focus closely, you can hear individual patterns within it. The soft whir of spindles, the faint clicking of tension wheels, the deeper rumble from the drive shafts above. Each machine has its own voice. The girl carrying bobbin trays returns again, collecting full cones from your row. You're getting quick, she says. You hand her the spools, trying to keep up. She balances the tray against her hip and continues down the aisle. The boy with the sweeping pan follows a few moments later, gathering cotton lint that drifts beneath the machines. Small details like that helped keep the factory running smoothly. Loose fibres could easily gather near belts or rollers, and cleaning the floors throughout the day reduced the risk of mechanical trouble. He hums quietly while working. Across the room, two workers begin talking softly while adjusting their frames. Their voices are barely audible above the machinery, yet the conversation seems friendly enough. The foreman walks past them without interrupting. Perhaps he senses that the day is nearing its end. You glance toward the high windows. The sunlight has softened into a pale golden colour that stretches across the spinning frames and the worn wooden floor. Dust floats through the beams like tiny drifting sparks. For a moment, the entire room seems almost peaceful. Then another thread snaps. Your fingers move quickly. Tie, release. The machine continues turning without interruption. Nearby, the man with the folded newspaper slips another look at the sports page before hiding it again. Your neighbour chuckles softly. He's been watching that score since sunrise. Even in a place ruled by machines and schedules, people still carry small pieces of the outside world with them. You stretch your shoulders briefly while walking along the row. Fatigue is returning. Now, though, it feels different from yesterday's exhaustion. Instead of sharp discomfort, your body carries a steady heaviness that seems to settle into your muscles. Many historians who study factory labour note that endurance became one of the most valuable skills workers developed. The ability to repeat the same physical motions hour after hour often determined whether someone remained in the job long term. You tie another thread, replace another cone, step forward. The rhythm continues. Across the room, a sudden shout rises above the noise. For a moment, several heads turn. A worker has tangled a section of thread badly enough that the spindle must be stopped. Another worker hurries over to help loosen the knot before it spreads through the neighbouring spindles. The problem is solved quickly. Within seconds, the machine returns to its steady hum. Moments like that remind you how delicate the entire system really is. Hundreds of spindles depend on threads thinner than a strand of hair, and yet together they produce miles of fabric each week. Your neighbour glances toward the clock mounted high on the wall. "Not long now," he says. The words bring quiet relief. Across the room, you notice the same subtle change in posture that appeared yesterday during the final hour. Workers stand a little straighter. More eyes drift toward the clock between tasks. The room seems to be listening again, waiting. Outside the windows, the sky has begun shifting toward evening colours. The light grows softer, and the shadows along the machine stretch across the floor. Inside the spinning room, however, the work continues exactly as it has all day. Thread after thread, spindle after spindle. You move carefully along your row, determined not to lose focus now. Tie the fibre, guide the thread, release. The machine hums steadily beside you. And as the final minutes of the shift approach, you realise something quietly remarkable. Only yesterday the factory felt overwhelming and impossible. Today it feels like a place you understand. The whistle has not yet sounded, but everyone in the room can feel it coming. The final stretch of the afternoon arrives with a familiar feeling now. The spinning room hums with the same constant energy that has carried the entire day forward. Rows of spindles twist cotton thread with tireless precision while the belts above continue sliding over their wheels in endless loops. You move along your row of machines with steady steps. Check the thread, guide the fibre, replace the cone, tie the brake. Yesterday, those motions demanded careful thought. Today, they happen almost automatically. Your hands know the distance between the spindles. Your ears recognise the rhythm of the machine beside you. The work has begun to settle into your muscles. Across the aisle, the woman who has spent decades in this room glides past her spindles once again. She repairs 2 threads almost at the same moment before moving forward without hesitation. Your neighbour watches her for a moment. "She could run this whole row in her sleep," he says. Workers who remained in mills for many years often developed astonishing speed and precision. Accounts written by factory inspectors in the late 19th century sometimes described veteran operators managing more than 100 spindles at once while maintaining steady production. Skill like that came only after thousands of hours beside the machines. The girl carrying bobbin trays returns once more, her arms carefully balancing the wooden rack of spools. She collects the finished cones from your frame and replaces them with empty ones. "Almost done," she says quietly. Her voice carries a hint of relief. Beneath the machines, the boy with the sweeping pan continues gathering cotton lint into neat piles. His broom glides across the floor with practiced movements before he empties the fibres into the large bin at the end of the aisle. A small but interesting note from mill safety reports explains that lint accumulation sometimes caused unexpected problems in textile factories. When fibres gathered too heavily near hot machinery, they could create fire hazards which made constant cleaning an important part of the daily routine. The boy moves on to the next row. Your neighbour leans slightly toward you. You'll notice something soon, he says. What? Everyone listening. At first you are not sure what he means. The machines continue roaring exactly as they have all day. Workers move through the aisles, repairing threads and replacing cones. But then you begin noticing the subtle change. Heads turn towards the clock more often. Workers pause briefly between tasks, as if measuring the remaining minutes. The room is waiting. You glance toward the tall windows. The sunlight outside has shifted again, glowing deep gold through the dusty glass. Long shadows stretch across the spinning frames and the worn wooden floor. The day beyond the factory walls is nearing its end. Inside the room, the machines continue spinning, thread by thread, spindle by spindle. Your hands move quickly again. Tie the fibre. Release the tension. The frame hums smoothly. Across the aisle, the man with the folded newspaper finally closes it and tucks it into his pocket. Game's over, he tells the two workers beside him. Your neighbour laughs softly. About time. Even small stories like that travel quickly across a factory floor. The foreman walks slowly down the central aisle once more, his notebook resting under one arm. He pauses beside a few machines, watching their movement carefully before continuing on. Supervisors often use the final hour of the shift to observe which machines ran smoothly and which might require adjustments before morning. Maintaining steady production depended heavily on these quiet inspections. Your neighbour stretches his shoulders briefly. Last minutes, he says. Fatigue presses against your legs again, but the thought of the approaching whistle carries you forward. Some researchers studying industrial labour still debate how workers experience these long days psychologically. Some diaries suggest people simply counted the hours until the whistle freed them. Others reveal moments of pride when a worker managed their machines efficiently through an entire shift. You suspect both feelings can exist at the same time. Another thread snaps. Your fingers move automatically. Tie. Release. The machine continues humming. Across the room, someone begins quietly whistling a tune beneath the noise of the spinning frames. The melody barely rises above the machinery, but it spreads slowly through the row like a shared signal. The end is close. You glance at the clock. Only a few minutes remain. The sunlight fades further beyond the windows. Workers straighten slightly, though no one stops working yet. The machines still demand attention until the final signal arrives. Then at last, the sound breaks through the room. The whistle. Its long cry slices across the factory floor just as it did yesterday. The note rises above the roar of the machines and echoes through every corner of the building. For a brief moment, the spinning room pauses. Then workers step back from their frames. The second day is finished. The whistle lingers in the air for a moment after it sounds echoing through the vast interior of the mill. The spinning frames begin slowing almost immediately. Belts above your head loosen their grip on the turning wheels, and the roar that filled the room all day fades little by little into something softer. You stand beside your machine and watch the spindles lose their speed. The change feels almost magical. A few seconds earlier, the room was alive with motion. Now the spinning frames slow until the thread coils stop turning completely. The belts sag gently above the machines, and the heavy engine somewhere deep inside the building quiets to a distant murmur. Silence spreads through the spinning room like a calm tide. Workers stretch their arms and roll their shoulders. A few shake their hands to loosen stiff fingers that have tied hundreds of threads since morning. Your own muscles feel the relief instantly. The soreness remains, but the moment the machines stop, you feel lighter, as if the constant pressure of the day has lifted from your shoulders. Your neighbour exhales deeply. Second day down, he says. You nod. The words feel surprisingly satisfying. Around the room, people begin the small tasks that close the shift. Full cones are gathered into crates. Loose fibres are brushed from the machines. Tools return to their drawers. Many mills required workers to leave their stations ready for the next day's production. Keeping the equipment clean helped prevent mechanical problems when the machines started again at dawn. The girl with the bobbin tray places her empty rack against the wall and stretches her arms high above her head. The boy with the sweeping pan empties one final load of cotton lint into the large bin. Across the aisle, the experienced woman wipes the metal frame of her machine with a cloth before stepping back. She notices you watching. "You lasted 2 days," she says with a quiet smile. You laugh softly. "That good." She nods. Some don't. The comment carries a simple truth. Factories during the industrial boom employed thousands of workers, but not everyone remained long. Some found the hours too exhausting. Others left for different jobs or returned to farms when opportunities appeared. Still many stayed. Wages, even modest ones, offered stability in towns growing rapidly around mills and railroads. You brush a thin layer of cotton lint from your coat and glance toward the door. Workers are already moving toward the corridor, forming a slow but steady stream leaving the room. Boots scrape lightly against the wooden floor as people gather their coats and lunch pails. The foreman stands near the centre aisle watching the flow of workers with calm attention. His notebook is closed now. For the moment, his workday is finished as well. You follow your neighbour toward the exit. The corridor outside feels cool and strangely peaceful compared with the roar of the spinning room. Conversations echo softly along the brick walls as groups of workers walk toward the yard. The smell of machine oil fades with every step. Ahead, the outer doors stand open. Evening light pours through them in warm golden colours. You step outside. The air feels fresh against your face. Across the yard, workers scatter toward the streets leading to their homes and boarding houses. Some walk quickly, eager for supper and rest. Others linger near the gates, finishing conversations that could not be heard above the machines. The tall smokestack rises above everything, still releasing a thin ribbon of smoke into the evening sky. You glance back at the factory. Only 2 days ago, the building looked enormous and intimidating. Now it feels more like a place you are slowly learning to understand. The machines inside have their rhythms, the workers have their routines, and you are beginning to fit somewhere within that pattern. Your neighbour nods toward the street. "Come on," he says, "supper's waiting." You follow him along the dirt road as the last light of the day spreads across the town. Windows glow with lanterns. A wagon rattles past carrying crates from the loading dock. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle drifts across the evening air. Factory towns often moved in step with the mills themselves. When the whistles blew, entire neighbourhoods shifted from work to rest almost simultaneously. Now the streets fill with tired workers returning home. You walk slowly, letting the quiet of the evening replace the noise that filled your ears all day. Behind you, the factory stands silent once more, its windows reflecting the fading sky. Tomorrow morning, the whistle will call again. But for now, the machines rest. And so do you. The night settles gently around the boarding house as you lie down once more. The bed feels softer tonight, perhaps because your body already understands the weight of the day's labour. Outside the window, the town grows quiet. The distant hum of wagons and footsteps fades into the calm rhythm of evening. Your muscles relax little by little. The faint echo of machinery still lingers somewhere in your thoughts, but it grows quieter with every breath. You remember the spinning frames turning beneath the tall windows, the drifting cotton dust glowing in the sunlight, the quiet nods from workers who have spent years beside the same machines. The factory is not simply a building of brick and iron. It is a place filled with thousands of small routines, repeated every day by people whose hands keep the machines alive. And tonight, for a brief, peaceful moment, all of that motion pauses. The streets outside fall silent. The smokestack stands dark against the sky. And as sleep slowly arrives, the long rhythm of factory life fades into the background like a distant memory. Rest now. The whistle will wait until morning. Sweet dreams.